Will the mysterious giant wolf adapt to the new environment after turning into human form? How will the relationship between her and the one who claims to be her mate develop? Can she truly get rid of the shadow of the past and become a happy member? Dive into the world of genetically modified werewolves. Subscribe. Chapter 15 Part 50 Woe. Tori said in awe. Her hands dropped to her sides and tried to not stare at Nine. I'll go get you some clothes, she said, her voice raising a pitch. After a second thought, Tori all but ran out the building. Once the door was shut, she leaned against the wall next to her. Tori let out a strangled sound. Goddess! What have they done to you? She whispered, remembering all the ghastly scars on Nine's body. Even so, Slade's mate was stunningly beautiful, even with everything those bastards did to her. She was extremely tall, roughly 5 feet 10 inches. She topped most males in the pack. Hell, even Ryan was only 5 feet 9 inches. Tori lightly giggled, knowing he wasn't going to be pleased about that. He was already sensitive about his height since all her exes were around 5 feet 11 inches and taller. Though she was tall, Nine had a strong build. Not some skinny twig, like those bitches that Tori had seen trying to get with Slade. No, Nine was practically built to be a Luna even if she didn't have an alpha mate. Sturdy muscular legs and arms attached to a curvy, but strong body that was covered by scars of all sizes, and what seemed like burn marks. Whatever Victor used must have stopped her from healing all those wounds. The only feminine-looking part was her face. But even then, Victor had left his mark, making her look intimidating and fiercer. Nine had a heart-shaped face, a small button nose and thin lips. Her skin was extremely pale. Tori could guess the reason was because Victor did not let her outside in the sun. A large scar ran jaggedly an inch above her right eyebrow to the middle of her cheek, cutting across her eye. Another scar was on the middle of her left cheek that stretched down to the bottom of her jaw and continued down her neck before stopping above her collarbone. It was a much cleaner cut, which could only mean that it was done on purpose and not an aftermath of a whip or werewolf scratch. Tori shivered in disgust at the thought that someone could treat another like that. The one thing that didn't change in the shift were her piercing cat eyes. Her white irises had light grey specks in them that made her black pupils more prominent. Tori was completely jealous of the fact that just like an actual cat, Nine's eyes were lined with black to make it look like she had on permanent eyeliner, her lower and upper lashes. Tori let out a whine when she realized that Nine also had long, thick eyelashes. She's so lucky. She groaned out loud, not caring if anyone could hear her. And her hair. Nine's hair was a dark auburn color. It could easily be mistaken for black, but if the lighting in the cell was brighter then you could see the rich burgundy red blending into her hair. Her hairstyle, though, was quite muddled and unkempt. It was cut short from the back, but grew into a thick mess on top of her head that extended to the front until ending in a heavy fringe that veiled her left eye. Tori snorted, realizing that Dexter must have given her the cut. Poor soul. Completely useless with scissors. She sighed. Tori finally realized the torment Nine went through her whole life, and she couldn't help but feel sorry for her. Victor was a pathetic excuse of a man, and will get what's coming to him. But for now, Tori was glad she could break through to her. If Nine hated her for it, then it was okay. She would slowly gain her trust again. And then maybe, or hopefully, Nine may want to be her first female friend. Tori lightly smiled. It had been a long time since she had friends that could put up with her. But it was okay if Nine decided not to. Kicking off the wall and jogging toward the pack house, Tori's mood lightened up, and so did her normal attitude. With the thought of Nine finally shifting into her human form, now she and Slade can get married and live happily ever after. She was buzzing with excitement at being the one to change Nine, and having the secret of knowing about the shift. Oh, imagine the deals she could make with this information. Goddess, Slade would sell his soul to her if she finally told him that his mate had shifted into human. Grinning deviously, Tori ran into the house. She was about to jog up the stairs when she bumped into her mate, who was heading in the opposite direction. Ryan quickly caught his mate around her waist only to notice her bouncing in his arms. Narrowing his eyes suspiciously, he asked, "What have you done?" Ryan figured out fast that his mate needed constant supervision, but as a beta he could not always do it, and for that he was super thankful and grateful. The last time he babysat Tori, he got in trouble for something she did. Never again, he promised himself. "Oh, nothing," Tori said giddily in I know something you don't voice. Ryan stared at her blank before wisely letting his mate go, and walked out the door like he never saw her. Shrugging, Tori ran up the stairs towards her room. She quickly took out the biggest pair of clothes she had and ran back down the stairs and out the house. When she finally reached the jailhouse, she was puffed out and leaned against the wall for support. "Oh my goddess. I need to work out more." She gasped for air, cursing the wolf genes for not working properly. Guess even with being blessed as a werewolf, she would need to work out to keep her strength up. Once she could breathe normally, she entered the cell to see 9 on the floor looking up at her cutely. "Or?" Tori clasped her hands together and cooed at 9's big pupils. She looked like a kitten when they dilate their eyes and just plain look adorable at everything they do. "What happened to you?" she asked and moved inside the cage. "I tried to walk," 9 replied through the mind link. Nodding her head, Tori stopped just in front of 9. "Stop looking at me like that or else I will steal you away from Slade," she said seriously. 9 tilted her head to the side, blinking twice, and Tori held in a squeal. 9 stuttered, since she had not shifted in the last 4 years. Her fine motor skills were seriously lacking. She couldn't walk, talk, and forgot that she has flexible fingers. It was why she did not shift. She was so vulnerable in this form. Dexter did want her to shift more often so she would still be able to use her human body, but Victor prevented it. He hated 9's human side and wished it didn't exist. He wanted her to only be a wolf with a human conscience. SSL. Tori figured out what she wanted to say and crouched down in front of her. "Watch my lips." She tapped her pale, pink lips with her finger. When 9's eyes drifted to them, Tori spoke slowly but clearly. "Slade." "Goddess, where's Slade when you need him?" Tori thought. Well, at least he'd like to know that 9 said his name first. Too bad she heard it first. She snickered inwardly. Still staring at her lips, 9's tongue got jumbled as she tried to say her mate's name. By saying his name, 9 would be accepting that he wasn't her master. For some reason, she didn't find it as hard as she thought it would be. Though she'd still be cautious around him. "SL Slade," she repeated and then looked to the she-wolf for confirmation. Close enough." Tori waved her hand dismissively, making 9 frown. At least her facial muscles were still working, she thought amusedly. "Okay, now say my name." Tori clapped her hands excitedly. She felt like a mother waiting for her baby to say their name. "Tori," she said slowly. "TT Tori." Another, but much deeper voice interrupted 9. Tori cursed when she smelled her mate, Nolan and Dexter. "Damn it. Now I can't use this to my advantage now that everyone will know that 9 has shifted," she internally pouted. "If you guys take one step into this cell, I will twist your balls off and then make you watch as I throw it into the ocean." She threatened and then hurriedly tried to dress up 9 in the top and pants. "Tori, what are you doing?" Ryan shouted through the gap in the door that he halfway pulled open. He tried to tug the door even more to peek in, but Nolan quickly pulled him back with one hand and the other covering his manhood. "Dude. I love my balls and I'm sure you do too." Ryan shot him a dry look. "But please don't go up against your mate on this," I'm still recovering from the last time she tried to do it." Nolan begged, his eyes looking pleadingly at his friend. Behind him, Dexter covered up a laugh with his hand. Ever since he moved to the pack, he'd experienced nothing but happiness. If you looked at him now, Dexter would seem like a totally different person. His eyes were brighter, he had laugh lines near his mouth and eyes he looked so carefree, like he never met Victor Bain. "Not cool." Ryan growled and aimed a punch to Nolan's stomach, making him double over in pain. Shaking his head, Dexter stepped forward and shouted, "Is Nine okay?" Inside, Tori scoffed. "What about me?" she shouted back, struggling to get Nine's legs through the holes. Her legs were not used to holding up her body, so Nine had to lean against the wall whilst Tori bent down and practically shoved her uncoordinated limbs inside the never-ending pants. "What about you?" was Nolan's response, but when Tori heard his grunt, she knew Ryan must have hit him. She sure trained him well, she thought with a smirk. "Finally!" she exclaimed, her arms feeling tired but her grin was still on her face. What was baggy for Tori, the clothes was form-fitting for Nine's figure, and a lot short for the pants. One thing was sure, the first thing Nine was doing when she gets to the pack house is take a long bath. It's a wonder how she survived with that smell and all the dirt over her. Tori was such a freak when it came to hygiene, and right now, she was way out of her comfort zone. "Arj? When's the last time you took a bath?" she asked, her face scrunching up in distaste. Nine struggled to form a sentence, so she settled for a couple of words. "T3 Mon THS. Right?" Tori nodded her head. "So you ready to become a celebrity?" she asked Nine excitedly, who tilted her head in that cute way. Tori couldn't help herself and pinched her cheek. "So cute," she gushed. Blinking, Nine watched as Tori made her way to the door, where she pulled it open, and in came Ryan and Nolan barreling to the ground. "Tried eavesdropping, did ya?" she said, clearly not amused. The boys sheepishly laughed. Nolan continued to lie on top of Ryan's back, and laughed when he tried to push him off. Nolan turned his head to Nine to get her to come lie on top of them both, obviously tell her not to crush them either, but then his eyes locked on a woman instead. "Who the hell are you?" he blurted, making all males turn towards the quiet young woman. Not one noticing Tori's large grin. Only Dexter knew who it was and quickly stepped over the beta and omega, his grin even brighter at the sight of his friend. "NN9. he exclaimed and laughed happily. "9. Both Ryan and Nolan exclaimed at the same time, a look of astonishment on their faces. Not only were they surprised because she was in human form, but also because of the very visible scars that weren't covered by the clothes. They were really hard not to overlook, and both guys tried not to stare. Obviously failing. To them, it was excruciating to even think of how Nine got it, let alone actually experiencing it. Their respect for their Luna just skyrocketed. It was only when Tori kicked them both in their sides did they drag their eyes away to moan and groan about their injuries. "Idiots!" Tori grumbled and crossed her arms, turning her attention elsewhere. Dexter jogged up his friend and gave her a warm hug. "Dexter!" Nine stuttered and gave a smile of her own. The thing about Nine's human side was that she was absolutely innocent. Every smile, look and touch seemed childlike. Her whole face would light up if you made her happy, or when she was curious about something. She was an open book that could easily be read. The scars would fade away in everyone's eyes because all they could see was Nine's pure radiance. They'd never guess that she held a terrifying beast inside of her. But she did. Even though she may be weaker as a human, Nine still had her predatory and dominant instincts that will lash out if she was pushed too far. She possessed the strength of a male werewolf, though still considerably weaker, because she was not used to her strength yet, and has little control over it. But in time she would be deadly both in wolf and human form. Look at you. Dexter said, still stunned at her transformation. He knew what shifting meant to Nine, and boy, he was so unbelievably proud of her. Nine grinned, her face brightening. She slowly pushed off the wall and held her hands out for balance, as she wobbled on her feet, but thankfully, Dexter was there to help her out by holding her arm. Suddenly Nine was surrounded by two eager male werewolves who acted as if their baby sister was growing up. Well, Nine might as well have been their sister since they treated her like one the minute she arrived in the pack. Ryan and Nolan bombarded her with questions, mostly being about her to keep talking and saying their names or asking if she wanted them to call Slade. Nine tried to keep up with them, but the guys were becoming too much for to handle, so Tori quickly stepped in. Or more like pushed in. All right, ladies. Tori shoved the two old women aside, rolling her eyes when they began to complain, but a well-raised eyebrow shut them up real quickly. That's what I thought. She snickered and then turned to Dexter, who was watching in amusement, and Nine just looked plain confused, which was adorable, especially with the way she tilted her head. Okay, so before we introduce Nine to Slade, I have to give her a bath. So without further ado, to the pack house. She ordered and pushed the guys out of the way again, before marching out the building, knowing the guys will follow with Nine. When she was out of earshot, Nolan snickered at Ryan. Ha! Ha! You have a drill sergeant as a mate. Ryan would have thought by now that his friend would have seen the punch coming, but he knew that Nolan was an idiot. Snorting as the Omega bent over, clutching his stomach in pain, Ryan moved to Nine's other side and put her arm around his shoulder, only to realize something very, very important. What the hell? How are you taller than me? He yelled, making Nolan double over in pain and laughter since he was still recovering from the punch. Nine blinked at him. She peered down at her body and then looked back at him. Genetics. She answered, and Dexter smiled, knowing she was holding back. If Nine had it her way, she would tell you everything she learned. Dexter made sure she learned everything taught in school in her age group, and was full of pride that if she did go to school, Nine would be at the top of her class. She was able to absorb information like a sponge, because she was always fascinated with the world and how it worked. The one thing that Dexter could not teach her was how to interact with others, or to show her new things that she had not seen herself, but a picture instead. Being in the arena hindered Nine's social growth, but he knows now that with this pack, she can finally live her life the way it's supposed to. Dexter snapped out of it to see Ryan scowl at Nine. Let's just go. Nolan, you help her. I don't want anyone to compare our heights and tease me about it later. He grumbled out the command and followed his mate's action and stormed out the room. And then there was two. Nolan said with a chuckle and a shake of his head. Nine looked at him with a frown. But THR is THREE of us. She said, looking at him like he didn't know how to count. No, I meant never mind. Let's just get you ready for the big bad alpha. He replied and moved to support Nine by letting her lean on him as she tries to use her legs. It took a while, and by the time they got to the pack house, Nine was able to stand on her own for a few minutes and take a few steps, but that was as far as she could go for the time being. Nolan gave her a piggyback ride the rest of the way when her legs collapsed. Dexter said it would take a few days for the muscles in her legs to be strong enough to stand by herself and walk without support. Standing outside the pack house or mansion because of its large size, Nine wiggled out of Nolan's grip, but kept her wide eyes on the building. Wow! She whispered in or when Nolan let her down. She still kept an arm on him so she wouldn't fall, but adrenaline was rushing through her veins at the thought of actually entering a house. Nine always saw houses on Dexter's laptop, but now she could finally enter one. Her need to know was so overpowering that she let go of Nolan and stumbled to the door. Nolan moved to catch her when she fell to the ground, but Dexter quickly pulled him back and shook his head. Shui eyes F fine A and unless you want T to be shoved out the way, then I suggest you stay back. Dexter grimly smiled and pointed to himself, "Expience," he said, silently referring to all those times he brought Nine something. She would always push him out the way to get a better look. Being human meant no difference when it came to Nine's curiosity. And Dexter was right. Nine picked herself, barely noting the scratch on her knee, and hobbled up the stairs with uneven steps and pushed the front door open. Grinning wildly, Nine was about to step in when she abruptly paused. Nolan and Dexter watched with interest as she pulled the door back closed, knocked on the hard wood and waited. Finding it too funny, Nolan burst out laughing at her cuteness. Even Dexter was having a hard time holding in his laugh. Can't breathe. Nolan gasped for air and held onto Dexter's shoulder for support while his other hand clutched his stomach. Nine turned her head to look at them with an adorable frown on her face. She opened her mouth to say something when the door burst opened in front of her to reveal a puzzled Tori, who was not used to answering the door, because everyone just barges in. "It's their house too. What took you so long?" Tori exclaimed in annoyance, grabbed Nine's arm and dragged her inside the house. Whilst Tori headed straight for the stairs, Nine had other ideas. Stopping dead at the entrance and making Tori jerk back, Nine's jaw dropped and her eyes widened at everything before her. She was speechless. No words could describe how she felt at that moment. "You live in inside H here," she stammered breathlessly. Giddily, Nine moved to touch the table to her left that held the car keys in a small bowl, but since everyone was either at work or school, the table was empty but still fascinated Nine. Behind her, Tori was gushing like a little girl while Nolan and Dexter just watched Nine with a gentle smile on their faces. Just looking at her reaction made them think of how much things they took for granted and not once appreciated what they had. Nine's head was looking everywhere wildly, from the ceiling to the living room on the left and a very large dining room to her right. She moved to the left, but was stopped by Tori, who had only one destination in mind. "Oh no, you don't. You can explore later, but you will have a bath right now," she exclaimed, and gripped Nine's arms and pulled her towards the stairs with force. But I want tea to see." She whined and tried to pull away, but she was once again reminded that she was dealing with Tori. "You leave me no choice." Tori turned her head to the stairs and shouted, "Ryan, get your beautifully I do squats ass down here, right now. Or you can guess who's sleeping with Nolan tonight." "Hey!" But no one heard the omega. A second later footsteps could be heard thundering above their heads and down the stairs. Ryan appeared next to Tori, but she mind-linked him what to do so in a flash. Nine was picked up and thrown over his shoulder, and then he began to trudge up the stairs without another word. Taken by surprise, Nine just hung limply as she was kidnapped. "Dex?" She called out to him with a sad frown and big eyes, trying to reach out with her hand. Nolan groaned loudly and covered his eyes to stop himself from going to help her, even though he wasn't the one she called for. "Bro, how the hell are you resisting that?" he asked Dexter and turned to look at him only to see his face beginning to crumble. "Tori, maybe we can give her a bath AF after a tour of the house?" Dexter asked like the weak man he is when it comes to Nine. Giving the boys a deep frown, Tori snapped, "No. Stop giving in to her no matter how cute and adorable Nine may be or how much I just want to kidnap her and keep her for myself so no one can see her cuteness." By the end of it, Tori turned into mush, but she was still trying to be tough about it. "Now if you excuse me, but I'm sure Nine needs someone to keep an eye on her." She huffed and pivoted on her feet and chased after her mate who was struggling to keep a hold of a wiggling Nine, as she tried to get out of his grip and grab whatever object that was within her reach. "Nine. Please stop," Ryan pleaded when her leg came up and hit him in the face. "Ah!" he cried out in pain. Tori quickly rushed to help her mate and grabbed Nine's wandering arms. "Nine, sit still. After the bath I'll let you explore. She yelled. But I just want T to touch it. 9 replied with an unconscious pout and aimed for the mirror hanging on the wall, but Tori grabbed them. Quick! Go! Go! She shouted at Ryan, who hissed, trying to get 9's legs under control, but nevertheless made a dash for their bedroom where Tori had a hot bath ready for her. They finally got her to their bathroom, and Ryan set 9 down before leaving Tori with the rest. Once her feet touched the ground, 9 wandered away to explore everything inside the bathroom on her wobbly legs. Tori sighed heavily. She was exhausted just by controlling 9, and now she had to bath her. Goddess help her. All right, 9. Tori rolled up her sleeves to her elbows, eyes locked on her target in determination. The quicker we get this done, the quicker you can do your exploring, she said, although her words fell on deaf ears as 9 was in Wonderland already sniffing the shampoo before putting it down, picking up another bottle and repeat. Ah! Tori groaned, let's get this party started, she muttered and then advanced on the she-wolf. Chapter 15 Part LL. Almost 2 hours later, Tori was ready to collapse. Just drop dead and then die again. That's how exhausted she was. Not even the brats she babysat were that bad. She made the mistake of giving 9 a makeover, which wasn't much really. It included trimming her hair to look neater, her biggest challenge because 9 would not sit still. Then bathing all that nasty dirt and horrible rogue smell on her. Actually, no, that was her biggest challenge because 9 was so fascinated with the bubbles that she didn't want to get out even when the water turned cold. Tori used up the rest of her energy reserves to magically get 9 out of the bath tub to rub lotion all over her body to help with the scars and hydrate her dry skin. She wanted to drop dead at that moment when 9 started to sample all of the creams, sniffing them before happily putting it on her body. She would have let it go because she was too tired to do anything, but 3 freaking bottles later. Tori just snapped, grabbing the bottle from 9's hand and hurling it across the room in pure fury, and snapped back to shocked she-wolf with a crazy look in her eyes. 9 was quiet after that. Tori had to wipe 9's body with a towel to get rid of all the excess cream on her and then finally put her in a white summer dress, because if she decided on pants and a top then her soul would have left her body to go and rest somewhere away from the over-curious she-wolf. Done? Tori gasped and looked 9 over. Her hair was untangled and neatly cut in a modern hairstyle. Her whole body was dirt-free and smelled like coconut butter, because that was Tori's favorite scent other than her mate's. Tori realized that 9 had much more blemishes on her skin than she thought, especially on her back. Deep gashes ran all over her back in every direction, ranging from small to large, deep to shallow cuts. She flinched whenever she rubbed the cream over it because she felt like she was only hurting 9 even more, but she looked like she didn't mind. Rubbing her eyes tiredly, Tori nodded her head in satisfaction, and then turned on her heels and walked into her bedroom before face-planting the bed and letting out a worn-out groan. Tori! 9 whispered. She was actually scared of her Slade's sister after she snapped. She actually wondered if Tori had a beast inside of her too. Her? Was her reply. Tori's eyes were shut, her mouth was opened, letting drool drip from the side, but she did not care. Ryan had seen much worse and knew not to mess with her when she was exhausted. Feeling the bed dip, she forced one eye open to see 9's face close to hers and looking at her innocently. Her eyes glazed over the marks on her face and Tori softened. Thanku. 9 whispered timidly. I never had a female Friday end before. She was melting. You like Dexter? 9 continued and Tori raised an eyebrow. She could have thought of a better compliment, but she would accept it anyway. But much scarier. 9 finished with smile making her face fall. Thank you, 9. She grumbled and then closed her eyes to rest. Ryan. Tori contacted her mate through the link. Take her to Slade and don't bother me for the next 3 hours. She said and then cut off the link. As much as she wanted to see Slade's reaction to 9, Tori was drained physically, making her brain shut down. At this moment, sleep was the only thing she was thinking of. 9 turned away from her sleeping friend to the door, where she could hear someone coming. Taking a whiff of the air, she noted it was Ryan and got off the bed to stand by the door. She was so tempted to see what's inside the room, but she stopped herself, because it was not her domain, and it would be disrespectful to her new friend. So she held back. The door opened and Ryan did a double take. He lowly whistled and then grinned. Slade is going to have a heart attack when he sees you, he said, crossing his arms. 9 frowned. I don't want him to have a heart attack. His my M abruptly stopping, she unconsciously bit her lip as Ryan watched her intently. You're? He encouraged with wide expected eyes. If she says it, then 9 was accepting that Slade was her mate. Damn, if only his friend was here to hear this. My? Her eyes widened comically. Come on 9, Ryan silently cheered. Just say the word. My mate. She whispered shyly and looked down to the floor. Ryan wanted to burst out in celebration and tell everyone, especially Slade, but he settled for a huge grin instead. All right. Let's go meet your mate, he said excitedly and moved out of the way to let her through. Ryan nearly forgot that 9 was still unsteady on her feet and quickly caught her around her waist, ignoring the fact that he was shorter than her. Yep, he would never get over it. They reached the front door where Dexter and Nolan were waiting. They too were stunned at 9, who looked gorgeous to them. The guys could only imagine Slade's reaction to his mate. Too bad he was out dealing with rogues that were trespassing his territory. But since Ryan got an update that Slade was coming back, they moved hastily out of the building to stand just by the trees waiting for their alpha. The guys wanted it to be a surprise, so they made 9 hide behind Nolan, because he was just her height. Ryan would have done it, but for obvious reasons he chose not to, and Dexter next to him. Ryan pulled up the front, and was the first to reach Slade, who had just returned. Running a hand through his hair, Slade's eyes showed how worn out he was. Between his mate and the pack, it had been extremely stressful for him. He was more than ready to go to sleep, but even then he would get a sleepless night without his mate. Shoving on the shorts and walking out the woods, Slade noticed his friends with Dexter. He immediately thought something was wrong with 9 and rushed to them. Is 9 okay? He questioned, concern etched into his face, he already looking like he was about to bolt to the jailhouse to check up on her himself. Through his distress, he barely picked up his mate's scent that was just a few feet away, and just thought it was his imagination. Ryan was the one who answered with a large grin. Oh 9. She's perfectly fine. He waved his hand dismissively. Slade calmed down, but he was still going to see his mate to make sure, even if it hurt him to. Okay. He nodded his head and rubbed the back of his head. I'm going to go check up on her anyway, Slade said, pointing in the direction of the jailhouse, and took a step when Ryan quickly stopped him. Before you go, you know how Nolan and I forgot to get you a present for your birthday, and we tried to cover it up by taking you to a club, Ryan said with a sheepish smile, Nolan copying his actions when Slade looked at him. Nodding at his best friend, he waited to hear the rest since he knew way before that his friends sucked when it came to remembering important dates. Well, Ryan dragged out the word, we have an awesome surprise for you that will top all the presents you have been given in your life. He let out a wicked grin. Now that got Slade's attention. He crossed his arms and waited to see what stunt his friends pulled. What did they get him? A helicopter? A submarine? A national park somewhere in Africa? Slade honestly had no idea when it came to those two. He watched with narrowed eyes as his beater moved to the side to reveal Nolan and Dexter, who were also beaming. Okay, on 3. Ryan said, trying not to shout out who it was in excitement. 1, 2, 3. Nolan blurted and pushed Dexter out the way to reveal 9, who was looking at the ants scatter on the ground. Slade's reaction was nothing what his friends imagined. They thought he would embrace his mate, kiss her, just anything really. But he didn't do a thing. He just turned into a statue, with his jaw dropped, but eyes only on 9, who was still looking at the ground in fascination, barely noticing her mate. But when 9 slowly raised her eyes to Slade's, he felt his heart fail for a couple of seconds before beating so hard and fast that he was scared that it might jump out of his chest. His limbs failed him, and so did the muscles in his jaw, both just hung limply. The only part of his body that was working was his eyes. They made sure to cover every inch of his goddess. His queen was pure perfection. That beautifully sculpted face that he would hold gently as he caressed her soft, creamy skin, running his thumb over those fierce battle scars, and then lean in to lightly brush his lips against hers, whispering tender, loving words. Slade was torturing himself by just gazing lovingly at his mate. A deep desire ignited inside his bright, emerald eyes, sending a fiery sensation throughout his whole body and setting his temperature on fire. Slade suddenly began to tremble. His hands shook furiously with the need to hold his mate. To have her close. Just looking at her was not enough for him. He strode towards her with an intense look in his eyes that made 9's widen in surprise and bewilderment. The way he advanced on her reminded 9 of a predator. She'd never felt like more of a prey than she did right at that moment as her mate stalked her. Without her permission, a sudden memory of Victor's sadistic gaze flashed before her eyes until it faded to reveal her mate standing a foot away. 9 panicked when Slade lifted his hands to touch her face. She flinched and took a step back, still remembering what he was capable of and the habit she had whenever Victor reached out to touch her. 9 didn't mean to do it on purpose, but it would take her time to adjust to having a mate, especially since he was the only werewolf that could hurt her. She watched as her mate jerked back at her, flinch, like she just ripped his heart out. His green eyes gradually dimmed and his hand retreated to his side. 9 frowned deeply, not understanding why her mate was hurt. All she did was keep a good distance between the two. She did not forget that he was her alpha first and then mate. But for Slade, with that one action everything went cold. So cold. Just when he needed his mate the most, for her to just reassure him that they still had a chance together and make it work, and yet she was still afraid of him. He'd almost forgot that she still thought of him as her master. Would she ever trust him again? He thought miserably. When Nolan noticed his friend's mood deflate, he quickly thought of something to cheer him up. "Hey Slade, did you know that 9's first word was your name?" he said in an overly cheery tone, thanking Tori for telling her mate who told him. Ryan nodded his head eagerly and then added, "Oh yeah, and she even calls you her mate now." But instead of making him feel better, Slade felt even worse, his face looking pained, and Dexter noticed it. He quickly shut the beta and omega up, because they were unknowingly flaunting that they were able to hold 9 and speak to her when she clearly rejected her own mate. Slade must have thought that 9 didn't even trust him enough to shift for him. N9 just needs time. Dexter reassured and laid a hand on Slade's shoulder, but he brushed it off. "Excuse me," Slade said with a stiff, forceful smile and then disappeared in the woods with his head low. The guys looked at their friend in sympathy. They could not blame 9, but even for them it was beginning to get frustrating. This was supposed to be a happy reunion. Sighing deeply, Ryan turned to 9, "Look, it's not." Halting, Ryan's brows furrowed and he looked around to try and find 9, who suddenly disappeared. Nolan noticed too and tried looking out for her, but only Dexter knew where she went. "What you smiling about?" Nolan asked the ginger-haired man in suspicion. Dexter pointed to the way Slade went off. N9 went after him. He grinned and then pivoted on his feet and walked back to the house, leaving behind the gaping guys. It was time for Dexter to step back and watch his best friend grow up and experience the world for herself, to think for herself and make her own decisions. And it was time for Slade to take over Dexter's role in taking care of Nine. He was finally letting her go. He was no longer going to be the one she always turned to, the one she needed the most. It would now be her mate. Though he would always be there for her, but he would stick to the sidelines and let Alpha Slade guide his mate. Dexter took a last look at the woods with a soft smile on his face. "Make me proud, Nine." Slade stormed through the woods, heading straight for the lake to clear his mind. He didn't even make it halfway when he came to a stop. He sighed and dragged his hands over his face. "I'm so stupid," he muttered angrily to himself, regretting his actions of walking away. He should have jumped at the chance to get closer to Nine. He was jealous of his best friends and slightly betrayed by her. Was he not worth trusting? After he proved that he was not like Victor. Muttering curses under his breath, Slade turned on his feet and began to stalk back to the house, determined to bond with his mate, or at least be close to her, because he clearly needed her more than she needed him. A snap of a branch caught Slade's attention as he whipped his head in that direction. Completely focused, his eyes scanned the area, ready to defend himself if he spotted the threat. He knew that it was no one from his pack, and that could only mean a rogue or a stray animal, though he could not confirm it by scent as the wind was coming from behind him. "Who's there?" he called out, letting his alpha tone seep into his voice. He frowned when the bush rustled and positioned himself in a defensive stance with his legs apart and arms tense to his side, ready to block if the threat was to attack. Then out of the bush, a figure suddenly came tumbling to the ground. Taken aback when Slade realized it was his mate, all he could do was stand there shocked whilst Nine got up and leaned a hand against a tree closest to her for support. Blinking at him cutely, Nine shuffled behind the tree, only allowing half her body to be revealed to Slade. Forcing his laugh down, but not his grin, Slade relaxed his shoulders. "What are you doing?" he said in amusement, and took a step forward. His movement caused Nine to retreat further back behind the tree, so he halted his steps and just waited for her to make the first move. Opening her mouth and then closing it, Nine struggled to speak to her alpha. She still felt a little intimidated by him, especially now that she was alone with him, but Dexter said he was her mate and that he would never hurt her. She wanted to truly believe that he was not like Victor or any of the rogues she had experienced. He was the only one who could provide her with the answers she seeks. Nine wanted to know what being a mate meant, and why was he so different to the other werewolves around her. She needed to know the answers. It was the only reason why Nine was standing in front of him. "Dexter said we were mates," she stammered, her voice low and soft compared to how she talked to the others. The alpha gulped. Nine noticed that he closed his eyes and breathed in deeply before reopening them. His eyes shone a darker green as he bore his eyes into hers. Nine involuntarily shivered, staring back. She'd forgotten in her human form that her temperature was much lower than her other form. But what she didn't know that it was not because of the cold that she shivered. Pulling her eyes away, Nine looked down and pushed off the wall. She watched her feet as she slowly moved them forward, her arms spread out to maintain her balance. Slade wanted nothing more than to go over and help Nine, but he forced himself to stay put. He would not ruin this moment, not when she was finally making the first move instead of him. With her face scrunched up in concentration, Nine almost bumped into Slade, much to his disappointment, if she didn't look up in time. Only being a few inches shorter, Nine was roughly up to Slade's chin. Her gaze drifted from his face down his nose and to his lips. For Nine, she was just studying him, but for Slade, he was quickly becoming aroused. His mate was inches away, her lips body so close to his, and yet he could not move or else she will retreat. It was pure torture. Slade wanted to groan out loud when he saw her gaze drifted down his body, sending a piping hot trail. He pressed his hands to his side to stop them from reaching out to touch her. Oh, goddess, her skin must be soft as silk, he thought to himself with a silent moan. Slade shuffled awkwardly on his feet to ease himself below the belt. Completely oblivious to her mate's torment, Nine's hand reached out where her fingers lightly brushed against the alpha's. She took a quick peek at his face to see if he was angry, but her mate was staring intensely at her like nothing could take his eyes away from her. He licked his dry lips and then bit his bottom lip hard. Curious about the action, Nine followed his lead and bit her lip too. Slade groaned out loud, letting out silent curses, his face looking pained at not being able to nibble her lip himself. Nine quickly stopped the action, because she didn't like hurting her alpha, even though she didn't know how she did it. Feeling brave, she looked back down at his hand and took a hold of it, allowing the pin pricks to spread all over her body. Looking back in his green eyes, she opened her mouth and said gently, "Dexter said we were con non." Nine scowled when she couldn't get out the word. "Connected." Slade filled in, his voice a lot huskier and deeper than before. Nodding her head, Nine let go of his hand, Slade once again forcing himself not to hold on, and slowly she raised it to lightly trail up his bare arm. He said, "Why you would nt hurt me bibibek because." He replied, voice becoming almost breathless. He squeezed his hand tight to not grab his mate around her waist and pull her into a deep kiss. "But damn it, she was making it hard." "Because it hurts you too." Nine repeated, her voice dropping down to a whisper, as she was distracted by her hand that reached her mate's broad shoulder, and then making its way to his neck. He said, "We are one. T that you are in, just as much as I am yours." Her fingers touched Slade's cheek, feeling the rough stubble he was growing, and gazed into his eyes, feeling herself become lost in them. For Slade, his everything was failing him. He couldn't think straight, or do anything except stare at Nine. Even if he wanted to move, his body was just paralyzed with his mate's touch. Nine was the first to snap out of it, and dropped her hand to take a step away from him. It seemed to her that her mind would get muddled up whenever she was close to him, and thought maybe it was a mate trick. Blinking away her dizziness, she stared at him strongly. I don't really understand what it means to be mates be, but I'm willing to learn," she said, her voice filled with determination. Nine looked down like a kid, and then peered through lashes at Slade. "Will you teach me?" Chapter 16. Will you teach me? Nine whispered timidly to Slade. Raw desire burned in the depths of his dark eyes. His devious mind conjured up sinful images to what things he could teach his mate. Biting back a moan, Slade clenched his fists tightly and stiffly nodded. His tense posture evaporated when his mate shot him a cute lopsided grin. That's it. He couldn't hold back anymore. With swift movements, Slade's arms reached out and wrapped around Nine's waist, securely making sure every inch of her body was pressed against his. He was in heaven. My mate. Slade whispered so softly and leaned down to press his face against the crook of her neck, breathing in deeply her scent and laying a kiss there. Goddess, how many nights had he wondered what she would feel like in his arms. He'd never want to let her go after this. He still could not believe she was his. She was so perfect. While Slade was having the time of his life, Nine was too busy watching the birds above them. Her hands stayed limp to her side because her mate's grip was too strong for her to move. Her mate's tight grip was still strange to her, and oddly enough, she liked it. It made her feel funny. But the good kind. Right? Slade said finally and forced himself to pull back, but kept his arms around her waist after he held her for half an hour straight without a single complaint from her. We should get back to the house. I'm sure everyone is worried about us. Just when he was about to move, Slade got distracted by his queen's beauty. She was flawless to him. Soon his body was heating up fast with the wicked thoughts that entered his mind. Would she allow him to taste her lips? He thought and stared intensely at them. His grip around her waist increased at the thought of just taking a small taste. 9 was his delectable, forbidden fruit, and soon he would not be able to hold back. What Slade didn't notice was that he was unconsciously leaning in closer to his mate. His eyes were set on the prize, but 9, who was thoroughly confused, leaned back as he moved even more closer until he was inches away. "Slade?" she questioned, her back beginning to arch backwards at his advances. But her mate was spellbound, even more so when she said his name. Finally having enough of his strangeness, 9's arm came up and she slapped her hand over his face and then pushed his face away. The sudden attack snapped Slade out of it and he backed away. He blinked in shock before finally settling into a sheepish expression. "Whoops." He chuckled nervously and rubbed the back of his head. Only blinking at him, 9 slowly moved forward to stand next to him and then grabbed his hand. Her mate's expression changed once again to surprise, his eyes shifting to their linked hands and then back to her. Was she finally feeling the pull? Slade thought with excitement. "I don't like falling. It's safer for me to use you for support." 9 explained without emotion, through the link equally crushing Slade's hopes. "Oh," he said, feeling himself deflate. But he cheered himself up by saying that she was holding his hand willingly. "All right," he grinned, "let's go." The mates slowly walked back to the house, Slade loving every moment 9 slipped because then he could wrap his arms around her. He purposely made the walk slow to spend the last moments with her before they were bombarded by the others. While on their walk, 9 asked questions about mates, but only the factual ones Slade could answer. He didn't exactly know how to explain to her how to be a mate. "It comes naturally," Slade said and gazed affectionately at his adorable mate. He noticed that she pouted whenever she was thinking deeply. "All you need to do is be yourself." He lifted his free hand to brush her thick fringe away from her beautifully striking eyes. 9 frowned at her mate. "Being a mate is stupid," she mumbled, making him laugh out loud. His deep voice made 9 freeze for a second, her eyes widening at him. For a moment she felt something inside of her before it slowly disappeared. Shaking her head, 9 continued to question her mate only for Slade to say, "Why don't we leave that for last and let you settle down in the pack house first?" 9 whipped her head to him, "I get to leave in the pack house." She gaped at him in awe. Slade nodded his head when they came into view of the house. "From now on you will only be living in luxury," he promised. His mind wandered to the cabin, and thought it'd be best to wait a little longer before telling 9. He didn't want her to think that she will be permanently living in there. Maybe it could be their little escape house, where they can spend time with only them. They walked towards the house and Slade opened the door for his mate to enter first. Feeling thrilled and extremely eager to explore, 9 gripped Slade's hand and tugged at it. "Can I go explore? Please?" she pleaded, her eyes shifting everywhere and then landing on him. Slade would have been a fool to say no that face. Something tells him that he was going to have an extremely hard time denying her anything she wanted in the future. Nodding his head as no words were able to come out his mouth, Slade watched as his mate stumbled into the living room. He jerked forward to catch her when she was falling, but 9 quickly got back up and started to touch everything that was new to her. Her eyes filled with happiness, and a permanent grin on her face. Slade leaned against the wall next to him with his arms crossed against his chest, his eyes followed his mate with both caution and gentleness. Soon enough, his friends and sister joined him to watch 9 at the sidelines. The scene was quite amusing to watch for an outsider. Tori's hands were on her cheeks, as she let out loud squeals at 9's childlike innocence. All she wanted to do was grab her in a big hug and never let her go. Her mate was trying to calm her down and obviously failing. He kept apologizing to those passing by and shooting Tori an annoyed look. Nolan had a bag of chips and was munching it down like he was watching an intense football match instead of just watching his Luna explore. He was even commenting out loud at the things she picked up, or touched, such as when Nine found someone's iPod under the couch. Ha! Which fool lost their iPod? Nolan barked out a laugh. Nine glanced at him before turning to the device. She had seen it before, but had no idea how to use it, so she pressed the buttons randomly, which turned on the music, making her almost drop it in shock as One Direction came blasting on. The crowd awed her except for Nolan, who chuckled nervously and shuffled his way to her. "That's mine," he whispered and plucked it out of Nine's hand and made a quick getaway, ignoring all the snickers. Meanwhile, Dexter and Slade watched on, their anxiety growing when Nine started to explore the big things like a shelf that could easily fall on her. Especially since she was practically a Bambi on her feet. The odd couple flinched, winced and jumped whenever something would look like it would tumble on her. In sync, they both took steps towards Nine when she fell again. Her mate and friend trying hard not to let their protectiveness get in the way. Nine spotted a trophy on the shelf above the TV. She moved towards and picked it up, but the gold statue slipped through her loose fingers, because she was still learning how to use them. The trophy fell, snapping into two. Nine looked towards the group with innocent eyes. "Whoops," she said, copying Slade's words, and blinked twice. Everyone forgave her instantly, except one. A loud squeak alerted everyone in the room to the culprit. Ryan had his hands clutching his head as he stared in pain at his prized trophy. He's won it in high school, and the only piece of proof of ever defeating Slade, even though it was a pie-eating competition. He put it on display so everyone could see that he was the one who bet the great Alpha Slade, but now. "No!" he bellowed out loud to the heavens. Ryan didn't even notice that he was across the room and on his knees in front of his beloved trophy. With shaking hands, he reached out and gently picked up the broken pieces and then turned to Tori with a pathetic pout and puppy eyes. "For the love of Tori," exclaimed, rolling her eyes, and walked towards her mate. She pulled him to his feet and then began to make their way to their room, where she had super glue stored in her drawer from the last time she broke the damn thing. Not that he knows that. Guess Nine did her a favor. Tori smirked wickedly. Nine stumbled her way to the kitchen, the most deadly place in the house. Older women and a few men were preparing dinner. With werewolves being the guests, all the help was needed. Though they were busy, most of the chefs paused in their cooking to peer at the innocent-looking she-wolf. Nine's jaw was dropped as she stood in near the island table. The kitchen was much larger than most, and that allowed her to spin in circles, not knowing what to look at first. Her eyes fell upon the microwave that was heating up something to the refrigerator that was packed with food. Her eyes drifted to different appliances, not lingering on one for too long before her attention was caught by something else. Those watching her got worried, especially Slade, who was biting his thumb nervously and watching on anxiously as his mate twirled, clearly overstimulated. Everyone gasped when Nine collapsed to the floor in dizziness. Slade jerked forward, but as he took a step, Nine quickly got up and brushed herself. "I'm fine," she said like nothing was wrong, and then went about touching things, but was quickly stopped when she reached the knives. A lot of the pack members knew of her naivety and were willing to teach her. They'll do anything for their Luna. Even if she was scary in wolf form. "I don't think this is good for my heart." Slade frowned, with his hand over his beating chest and a pained expression on his face. Dexter patted his shoulder in comfort and empathy, clearly knowing his ache. "What is going on here?" Slade's mother and father entered the kitchen. Lillian squealed, cupping her face when she spotted Nine, easily identifying her by her scent. "Oh my goodness. She's beautiful," she exclaimed while Nine was nitpicking at the food. A strand of spaghetti was sticking out of her mouth when she spotted the older female. Paul had to physically restrain his gushing wife from rushing to Nine, who just stared blankly before slurping up the pasta and then going back for more. "She is so adorable," Lillian cooed. Her son shuffled closer to his mate, to protect her from his overbearing mother. "Mum, please stop." Slade pleaded and unconsciously wrapped a hand around Nine's waist. She looked to the arm and then to his face before copying his actions and wrapping her arm around his waist. Nine gazed up at him, silently asking if what she was doing was right. Slade's eyes were burning with desire to kiss his mate at that moment, but Nine turned away before he could. "Damn!" He cursed and scowled at his missed chance. "Parents," Nine whispered, staring at Lillian and Paul. Everyone heard her and quieted down. "Dex told me about pa parents." She tilted her head to the side and regarded them with indifference, clearly not understanding their importance they play in a family. "He said I had a mother and that she was nice." Everyone hung on her words, their minds drifting to their own parents. "I don't have a father though, and not human at least. Makes me wonder what's it like to have parents." Nine scratched her head and glanced around the room, noticing everyone staring at her. Lillian having tears in her eyes and was close to breaking down, while Paul was rubbing her arms soothingly, already feeling his protectiveness over his daughter-in-law. They both made a vow to be the greatest parents for Nine, to give her the love she deserved. Paul didn't care that it was his own son that he was going to have to threaten. He was going to be doting father to Nine. Lillian having similar ideas, though she had two lovely daughters, it wouldn't hurt to have another. She could just picture the clothes she could dress Nine in. Dexter looked down in despair. He didn't have to hide anything when it came to Nine's lineage. She had a right to know about her family. Slade on the other hand felt anger towards Victor for robbing Nine's chance of being in a loving family. He vowed to make his death a very painful one. Slade moved to comfort his mate, when suddenly he was pushed out of the way. "Move. Let me hug my daughter," Lillian cried, ignoring her stunned son, and wrapped her arms around Nine in a big, motherly hug. "I will be your mother, sweetheart. You have a family now and there's nothing that can stop us. If anyone hurts my baby from now on, then I will strangle them." All gazes seemed to drift to Slade, who raised his hands in surrender. His eyes wide in shock at the thought that they could even think such a thing. Nine on the other hand was distracted by the older female, saying that she was going to be her mother. At first she was doubtful, but something in the warm hug made her change her mind. Her loving touch was filled with such tenderness, gentle emotions, something so foreign to Nine, but she liked it. Her arms slowly reached up to wrap her arms around the woman. Bending down, Nine laid her forehead on the woman's shoulder. Her eyes drifted close and she breathed in her strange but comforting scent. She liked it a lot. Dinner came and went by quite quickly for the sake of Nine. Many werewolves came up to meet their future Luna, who still had to go through the ritual of being accepted as part of the pack, but they were eager nevertheless. Slade had to act as a bodyguard and tell the eager pack members when to leave. His mate barely saying a sentence throughout the whole ordeal, though everyone didn't mind. They just assumed she was shy around them in her new form. But Nine was more interested in the food and new scents surrounding her, especially those who had multiple smells lingering on them. She made a game of trying to figure out what it would be. Slade sighed in relief when it was time for bed. Then suddenly his heart skipped 3 beats. Where was his mate going to sleep? He thought nervously. With him in their room. His eyes went hazy and his mischievous mind brought up the image of his mate in his arms, cuddling in their bed, or possibly doing other activities that requires no clothes, and to feel her skin touch his, and a tugging to his left snapped him out of his dreamy state. Turning his head, Slade tried not to look like a deer caught in the headlights, as Nine stared at him curiously. They were both standing outside his room and Nine was wondering why he wouldn't let them in. Chuckling uneasily and rubbing the back of his head, Slade looked sheepish as he blurted, Nine, do you want to share this room with me or have your own?" Slade silently begging she chooses the first option. "Why would we share a room? she asked with a tilt of her head, an adorable pout. Slade found it hard to swallow. He could feel his hand twitch at the thought of knowing the bed was just a few feet away them. He could just pick her up and ravish her from dawn to dusk. Because, he let out another forced laugh, it's what mates do. His voice drifting into a questionable tone, and then he quickly added, if that's what you want to do. I could prepare another room for you if that is what you desire. Desire for 9 is what you really want. His conscience mocked. Slade winced at his thoughts, but put a straight face on when Nina narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously. You said you would teach me how to be a mate, so we have to sleep together, if that is what a mate does. She said and grabbed his hand firmly so he couldn't escape. While she looked adorable with her determined face, Slade was cursing like a sailor in his head. This is a bad idea. Slade's nerves were running amok, and he felt tremendously guilty for using the mate card to get what he secretly wanted. His mate then pulled him into their room and shutting the door, making him stiffen. A very bad idea. Slade breathing doubled and his eyes bugged out of his head when she let go of his hand and headed straight for the king-size bed. 9 laid down on her back and stretched out her arms to the side. Her legs sliding on the dark covers, every movement she did was just enticing him to take her. Unconsciously he let out a moan when she lifted herself up and leaned against the heels of hand. Her head was tilted to the side, letting her fringe fall to her left eye as she gazed at him. Goddess, did she look beyond divine. He wanted her so badly. Slade was scared that a certain part of his anatomy would just fall off. He was holding out for so long, and he might just snap with the way she acts even though she wasn't teasing him on purpose. The only way he could think to get his mind off his delectable queen was to contact his friends through the link. Hopefully they would give him some advice. I don't think I can sleep with 9. He confessed, eyes never leaving her as she got up to search the rest of their room, which was large, but fairly empty, only having the things needed. From the entrance the bathroom and walk-in closets were to his right, and to the left was his bed. Straight ahead was the balcony looking over the woods as well as the lake. Why not? Both Ryan and Nolan asked at the same time. Because I feel like I'm going to ruin her innocence and purity. He exclaimed and ran a hand through his ruffled hair before running it down his face. I'm not good enough to be with her. What happens if I attack her in my sleep? And that's when he began to panic at the possibility of that happening. Slade didn't trust his body at that very moment. Maybe he should just sleep in another room. She's your mate, Ryan said, interrupting Slade's thoughts of making a run for it. Nolan then added, yeah, it's not like you are doing anything wrong. Besides, if I was into dudes, you'd totally be on top of my list. And about the attacking part, if you are good then she won't complain. Slade was too tired and nervous to retort to Nolan's comments. Instead he groaned through the link. I know, but look at her. Slade sent a mental picture of 9, who was back on the bed, but this time sitting on her knees in the middle of the bed with a cute and innocent look on her face, as she ran her hand on the silk covers. The boy paused for a second. Bro, you're right, you can't sleep with her, Ryan said seriously, feeling his brother instincts kick in. Yeah, you horrible, old pervert, how dare you prey on young and innocent girls? Nolan teased, making Slade send a mental shock to him. Oh? Nolan exclaimed in pain, and that was all Slade needed before he cut Nolan off from the link. Ryan laughed at his friend and then calming down. Does she want to sleep with you? He asked, letting the mating side take over from the brotherly one. Yes. And before Slade could explain further, Ryan interrupted saying, well, there's your answer. Sorry bro, but I'm tired. The training you give us is torture. And then he was out. Useless. Slade thought of his friends. You coming? 9 asked, her pupils dilating before contracting into slits. Why must you torture me? Slade mumbled, looking at her longingly, and then headed straight for the bathroom to take care of his needs. Hopefully it would aid him somewhat. The door shut, making Nine blink at her mate. She peered around the room, not knowing what to do. She finally decided to go to sleep and laid on the covers. She'd never felt something so soft. It didn't take her long for the exhaustion to catch up on her, and soon Nine fell into dreamless sleep. Slade exited the bathroom with a fresh pair of boxers. He didn't trust himself to walk into the room with just a towel on, even though the boxers were little help as well. He figured quite quickly that Nine lacks the knowledge about the intimacy between a man and woman. That, and he just didn't want to explain his constant erection that stands out tall and proud. He paused midway in drying his hair with a towel to gaze lovingly at his mate. A small smile graced his face when he saw her sleeping figure. Throwing the towel at a nearby chair, he moved to her side and reached out to tenderly caress her cheek with his knuckles. "My love," he murmured and leaned in. "My mate." He replaced his knuckles with his lips, running along her jaw and over her battle scars towards her lips. "My queen." Slade pressed his lips firmly on the corner of hers, lingering there and savoring the moment. At that moment, Slade got the strength he needed to hold on a little longer. He promised to wait until Nine was ready to be a mate. She was still learning, so he would hold off all thoughts about kissing her and marking her delectable neck, even if it pains him to do so. Pulling back, he smiled softly. Slade's green eyes shone with pure love and devotion as he gazed down at Nine. When he noticed that she wasn't under the covers, he carefully lifted her up in his arms. Her weight felt like a feather to him. He pulled back the covers, but before he set her down, Slade couldn't resist keeping her in his arms a little longer, just gazing at his mate, not believing that she was his. Slade held his breath when she shifted in his arms. Her head moved closer to his neck, where he felt her nose brush against his skin, breathing in deeply his scent and letting out a small mew before settling down. Letting out a light chuckle at her cuteness. Slade slowly placed her on the bed and pulled the covers over her. Moving to his side on the bed, he got comfortable, making sure he was only on his side. He was afraid that if he was any closer, then he would hold Nine in his sleep and never let go. He didn't want her to scare when she woke up with his arms around her. With a heavy sigh, Slade turned on his side so he could at least see his mate. He let out a lazy smile, knowing that Nine was going to be the first and last thing he sees every day from then on. "I'm one lucky bastard," Slade thought to himself, and then closed his eyes. As soon as he was fast asleep, his body betrayed him and searched for his mate. Only once she was in his arms did his mind and body fully succumb to a blissful sleep. Be part of our werewolf community. Subscribe.